everyone. I'm Laurie Levinson, Professor of Political and Justice Studies at Governor State University. It is my pleasure to welcome you. It's equally my pleasure to welcome President Elaine Maiman, who will say a few introductory comments.
It's a pleasure to see you here for the Political Forum. I want to thank Dr. Levinson for organizing this, and I also want to thank the faculty panel members for participating in this discussion. You know that this is the first of two forums on the changing political terrain of American elections. The second one will be on October 29th, and I hope that you will all attend that too. How many of you are GSU students? Oh, great. Okay. Are you in a particular class? Or you just came because you're interested? That's even better. It's so important for a democracy that we have an electorate that is informed. And having panels like this, university has a particular role in making sure that we do everything we possibly can to engage students and to create that informed electorate. Our democracy is based on it. Let me mention to you that we have a presidential election, of course, but we also have a number of state and local elections and questions on the ballot and all kinds of things that it's very important for you to inform yourself about. And let me give you another date, and I hope you will write this down. We're going to have a candidates forum here at Governor State University, and it's going to be the candidates for the state legislature. And in some ways, that state legislature affects our day-to-day lives as much as the presidential candidates in the presidential election does. So the date and time for that is October 18th, Thursday, October 18th, and it's going to be in the morning at 9 a.m. So I hope that some of you will be able to schedule that and come. The forum is co-sponsored by the Southland Chamber of Commerce. So we're going to have in the audience some business people as well as students, and I think it's really important that we be there. And I don't know if you all have the GSU Votes button, but we have to get those for you. We have some buttons that say GSU Votes, and not only is it important for us to hear the candidates on the 18th of October, but it's important for them to see us and to know that we are engaged, involved. We're going to ask them questions about supportive education, and we're going to vote. And I think that's very, very important indeed. Our student government has been sponsoring for the last couple months a major voter registration drive, and we have registered on this campus. Anybody want to guess how many in the last month or so? How many new voters? 100? Other guesses? Okay, well, if it's the Price is Right, then you went over the number, but the number is very impressive. It's 320, and I think that deserves some applause. 320 new voters. Registering new voters is one part of what we have to do. Making sure that those voters are informed on the issues, are not going to be the slaves of sound bites. Voters who are going to really make sure that they know what the issues are and what the underlying points and principles are to the issues before us. If we educate ourselves, then we are not going to be vulnerable to taking at face value whatever a candidate says. And that's how we'll have a strong democracy. So I want to thank you all for being here. It's more important than you can possibly imagine to inform yourself, to register, and to vote. Thanks very much.
And thank you very much, President Maiman. I feel like saying in all else's commentary, because in the nutshell, I think Professor Maiman captured what we're trying to do here tonight. And what we're trying to do is get you excited about becoming engaged, not only in the election itself, but in the political system generally. The election will be the first Tuesday of November. Votes will be counted, but it goes on. The political process is not simply about elections. It is about much broader issues of what our society is all about. So hopefully you will stay engaged, become engaged, vote, and stay engaged after the election. This program is being co-sponsored by the Graduate Political and Justice Studies program at Governor's State. It is a graduate program that every 4 years we sponsor such a forum as this. And for the first time, it is also being co-sponsored by the Consortium for Civic Engagement at Governor's State University. The Consortium for Civic Engagement is a broad, university, community-based consortium of major leaders in the region helping to get people engaged in the political process. So hopefully you will become engaged from what we do here today. We've logically figured out what we are each going to present. We're holding our comments to no more than 10 minutes apiece. And then we will open to questions, answers, and comments from the audience. So hopefully what you hear will be thought-provoking. It will get you to engage in this discussion as well. This is not to be a one-sided discussion. I'm opening up with some preliminary comments. The theme of today's program is the changing political terrain of American politics. And what is the political terrain? Traditionally, the political terrain has been based on the premise that we are indeed, we the people, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. We've set up mechanisms called elections by which we have a say in politics. If you look at the traditional literature, you will see references to the political terrain. All assume this notion of government being responsive to the people. David Easton, the developer of systems theory analysis in political science, gives us a model in which there are inputs of political demands into the system which result in being processed by the political system and results in the outputs, the public policies, procedures, laws, distributions, and so on of our government. In other words, he saw government as responsive. He did not assume that everybody has the same input. He does account for the fact that it is very likely that there might be some within society that are better well mobilized, have more resources to influence government, and so on. Dean Walter Burnham wrote a classic book called Critical Elections, and he too assumes we, the people, have influence. In critical elections, he looks at those elections in which political parties somehow fall short of what we, the people, want. And as a result, in a critical election, third parties tend to emerge. There's enough of the electorate that's disenchanted with the two-party system that they vote 7% or more for a third party. And this is he calls this a critical election because usually the election after such elections, there's a critical realignment of the electorate. Why is there a realignment of the electorate? Walter Dean Burnham argues that the realignment is the result of the two parties saying, hey, wait a second, guys, we fell short, we lost a lot of our traditional base, we have to change our political appeal. Again, there's the notion that somehow government and the political process and the electoral process are responsive to the people. However, today we can look at the political terrain from a much different lens than that of a government and electoral system that is responsive to the people. The last critical election that people uniformly agree was a critical election was the election leading up to the New Deal. There was clearly a realignment of the electorate as a result of the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt. Increasingly, labor, the working class, African Americans, blacks, Jews, and Catholics began to align more and more with the Democratic Party. This continued on, extending into the Kennedy administration, where this coalition of forces became further solidified, and it even continued on through much of the Johnson administration. Something unusual happened about this time. There clearly was a perceived notion that increasingly the electorate was moving toward the Democratic Party. More importantly, they were moving toward progressive legislation. Progressive legislation included such things as, during the New Deal, the recognition of the legalization, the legality of labor unions, the role of government in not only extending its power, but more importantly, taking on a responsibility for furthering the economic and social welfare of the American people. A couple things happen. One, Barry Goldwater loses big time against Lyndon Johnson. There was this notion, here was a person representing ideas of the right, ideas of lesser government, not more government, ideas that government was indeed not a positive but a negative force, losing in rather large numbers. It was the largest landslide up until that moment in American political history. It should be noted that during the time of the New Deal and Johnson's defeat of Barry Goldwater, the distribution of income changed dramatically in this country. As Joseph Stiglitz and Robert Reich have noted in both of their books on inequality in America, in 1927, 1% of the American population earned 24% of the income in the United States. By what Stiglitz argues is that this maldistribution of wealth, with such a small percentage controlling such a large percentage of the income, it diminished aggregate demand and caused the Great Depression. From the election of Franklin Roosevelt, throughout the New Deal, throughout even the Eisenhower years and the Kennedy-Johnson years, there was a continuing redistribution of wealth. And again, this wasn't taking from one to another, but such things as the legalization of unions, where workers could gather together and effect change in the workplace through collective bargaining. Mechanisms such as that resulted in this redistribution. Now, with the defeat of Barry Goldwater, there was a perception that indeed the majority of Americans had sided with this progressive image of what American society ought to be. Beginning with the defeat of Barry Goldwater, there was a conscientious effort to change the political agenda of this country. The right, in part, funded major think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Cato Institute, all very pro-market institutes to change the discourse in American society. More recently, you will hear probably more and more in the newspaper about a very famous memo that Justice Lewis Powell of the Supreme Court wrote. And I'm just quoting a bit from the memo. He says, "No thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack. This varies in scope, intensity, in the techniques employed, and in the level of visibility. There has always been some who oppose the American system." I notice he equates the market system with the American system. And there have always been those who opposed the American system and preferred socialism or some form of statism, in parentheses, communism or fascism. And he goes on and he continues to explain how we must change the political discourse in the defense of the free enterprise system. And this is a justice of the Supreme Court. This memo is dated August 23rd, 1971. What's important is that this memo was to the chairman of the Education Committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. One, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a vested interest in defending an unregulated free enterprise system. Secondly, it was not to the Chamber of Commerce per se. It was to the chairman of their Education Committee. Again, the thrust here is that between the formation of the Heritage, the Cato, and the American Enterprise Institutes, and with this notion of bringing in the Chamber of Commerce to change the discourse, to change the way political issues were being framed, took a dramatic turn. This changed again in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. With the election of Ronald Reagan, it was a payoff, essentially, of the Heritage Foundation, the Cato, and the American Enterprise Institute. What we had was the reascendancy of a force that promoted the free enterprise system. Now, normally this is a healthy discourse. To what extent should government be involved in the political and social welfare of the American populace? We had something a little different going on here, though. And what we had different, I think, changed the terrain of the American elections. It changed the terrain of the American elections in several ways. There was an increased involvement in the mass media, an increased involvement of a large capital, especially in the funding of super PACs that resulted from the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. And it changed the way that issues became framed. For example, if you look at the Affordable Health Care Act, you see something that tends to benefit most people. The Affordable Health Care Act will extend health insurance to all by 2014, those with pre-existing conditions included. The Affordable Health Care Act, and again, I'm reading, and this is public relations from the White House, so you can take it with a grain of salt, but it's, I think, pretty solid data. The Affordable Health Care Act has already had a positive impact on 86 million Americans who have gained preventative health care, such as mammograms, as a result of the Affordable Health Care Act. 13 million Americans saw a rebate in their health insurance because the health insurance companies charge too much for administrative costs. It has helped 5.3 million seniors as the donut hole in their pharmaceutical coverage has been closed, saving each an average of about $600 a year. And it has helped 6.6 million young people stay on their parents' health insurance until the age of 26. This is an important year because it gives students time to graduate college and finally get a job that will provide them some form of health care. So again, this act on the notion of we the people sounds like, hey, this is a great thing for the American people. But the debate is not couched in those terms. The debate is framed much differently. The challenge to the Affordable Health Care Act was not that it did not benefit the American people, it was an infringement on American liberty. And that's indeed how they proceeded to argue before the Supreme Court, that the mandate for health coverage was an infringement on American liberty. So what we have is not this free discourse of these are the issues, how will you benefit from this policy or that policy, but you have a reframing of the issues away from the who benefits and who pays to one of grandiose notions of liberty and so on that truthfully I would argue in the Affordable Health Care Act is a very minor aspect of it. So what this has been meant to be is a lead-in to how this political terrain has changed. And we, in the next hour or so, will be looking at such issues as the role of special interest groups, the role of super PACs, again created as a result of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, and the role of social media, and we will go from there with questions and answers. So be thinking actively, because we want to be challenged, we want to hear your comments, we want to hear your questions at the end of our few moments. Chelsea?
Hi, I'm Chelsea Herring. I'm a professor in the Social Science and Political and Justice Studies program. And I'm going to talk about something Dr. Levinson mentioned at the beginning of his introduction, and that is this notion of inputs, that there are certain inputs on American government and access and levels of influence in American government. And those levels of access and influence aren't necessarily equal and have very much changed over the past couple years with the Supreme Court decision that Dr. Levinson mentioned that I'll get into, and the role of money in American elections. So I want us to kind of think about that a little bit and look at that this evening. We talk a lot, I teach an American government class here, and I'm happy to say I see most of my students here, so thank you. A lot about elections and the role of the average citizen in elections and how much does our vote matter and how much does our engagement matter. And I think these are valid questions, as a lot of people, I think, feel a certain sense of frustration with the electoral process. And one of the things we talk about is how important elections are to a democracy, especially to a representative democracy, where we're electing people to serve our interests. But the bigger question is, are our interests really served, or are special interests or elite interests served? And elections are really important in a democracy because they really do provide the link between citizens and representatives in a democracy. They're our way of saying, here's who we want to serve our interests. And there's an understanding in American democracy of one person, one vote, that we essentially have an equal say in the electoral process, that one person's vote is worth just as much as another person's and no more. We have this idea in democracy of free, fair, and open elections, that we can all be included in this process. While historically that hasn't been true, we've worked more towards an idea of universal suffrage. But I think a question that has arisen in the past couple years, particularly as a result of the Citizens United that I'll get into, is what if votes are no longer the major currency in American elections? What if what counts more now is money? How much you can raise, who funds you, how much you can spend, and kind of what comes along with that money. And the notion that money matters in elections is not anything new. It costs money. It costs money to get your name out there, to advertise, and all of that. But to what degree does money matter? And to what degree does it seem to matter now in 2010, 2012? And there's a lot of research being done in political science about the impact of money. Essentially, the more money a candidate spends, the more votes they tend to receive. There's a correlation between money spent and votes. The candidate who spends the most money is most likely to win. So there's a connection here between money and electoral success. The issue becomes elections seem to be getting more and more expensive, with 2008 being the most historic in terms of money raised and the impact of money. For example, 2008 election, Obama raised over $600 million. McCain raised about $300 million. 94% of those up for re-election in the House and the Senate races, 94% went to the candidate who raised the most money. The average cost of winning an election in 2008 was $6.5 million for a Senate race and $1.1 million for a House race. And this money is not necessarily coming from a wide distribution of sources. For example, business groups, including PACs and bundled business interests, spent nearly $2 billion in 2008 to influence the election. 2012 is expected to far surpass the numbers in 2008. And so this is becoming an increasing problem or issue in American elections. So let's get into why this is changing. How many, just show of hands, are familiar or at least have heard of the Citizens United versus the FEC Supreme Court decision? Okay, so some familiarity. Okay, just a little background. Citizens United is a conservative nonprofit corporation that in 2007 produced a documentary attacking Hillary Clinton when she was running for the Democratic nomination. The FEC essentially accused Citizens United of violating a corporate ban on spending in federal elections that was under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2001. Citizens appealed, saying that no, they didn't violate this Campaign Reform Act, and they appealed all the way up until the Supreme Court after lower courts ruled against them. And essentially what the court case eventually in 2010, there was a 5-4 vote in favor of Citizens United, so overturning previous court decisions. And the decision is pretty huge because what the decision said is that corporations can be treated like individuals, and they have free speech rights that are protected by the First Amendment. And speech essentially comes in the form of money, of donations. So donations are being treated as a form of speech for corporations, and this is protected just as our individual free speech rights are. And so what this did is essentially say corporations have the same right of political speech as individuals and are free to spend on behalf or against any candidate in federal elections. And this allowed corporations, and by implication labor unions, to raise and spend unlimited contributions without being subject to federal limits that had previously been determined under campaign finance reform. These, oftentimes these contributions are independent of candidate campaigns or of party campaigns, but they can run in support or opposition to particular candidates or party platforms. They are not required either to participate in complete or immediate disclosure of who's funding the message. This is huge in terms of knowing kind of whose voice is being represented, who's behind these campaign ads. And what the ruling ultimately did is undermine previous congressional action around campaign finance reform and trying to regulate what happens with money in elections. So there are a couple things that then resulted from this major Supreme Court decision. One, it opened the door to what we now know as super PACs, super political action committees. And this type of organization essentially provides outside spending, and it has almost tripled since 2008, which I already said was historic in terms of money. It's tripled since then, since the Supreme Court decision. With conservatives, actually, and those against Democratic candidates, outspending liberals by almost double in terms of the super PACs. And just show of hands, do you all know what a super PAC is? A couple people? Okay. So essentially what super PACs are, again, they're outside of political parties, they're outside of official candidate campaigns. But they can be individuals that group together, corporations that form groups, labor unions that form essentially political action committees that are supportive or in opposition to a candidate or specific issues. They are free of contribution restrictions with the essential ability to raise unlimited funds from individuals and corporations. As of October 2012, so just this month, there have been 927 super PACs that have formed, working to influence this election. So far, they have reported receipts of almost $400 million in contributions, spending about $333 million of that already to try to have influence over this election. Most, again, have been a little lopsided in terms of support of Mitt Romney and conservative candidates and against Obama and some of the more liberal agenda. Some of the top super PAC donors, just to kind of throw some names out there, the Adelsons. The Adelsons are a couple that own the Sands Corporation in Las Vegas. They are behind, and these are the ones that have actually voluntarily, publicly disclosed that they're behind these super PACs. There are others we don't know who they are. But they are part of the Winning Our Future and the Restore Our Future super PACs. So far, they have donated $35 million to this election. And they're projected by the end of this election cycle to spend anywhere upwards of $100 million, just this couple. There's a quote by Mr. Edelson in Forbes magazine that says, "I'm against very wealthy people attempting to influence elections, but as long as it's doable, I'm going to do it." And this is not just on the conservative side. I'm not trying to, pick any one side. Ann Cox, for example, owner of Cox Enterprises, has been very supportive of liberal candidates and of Obama. She so far has spent $3.5 million, and she's part of the super PAC Priorities USA Action. Same with Jeffrey Katzenberg, owner of DreamWorks Entertainment out of California, supportive of liberal candidates and Obama. He's already spent $2 million to influence this election. And he has a quote in USA Today where he says, "The stakes are too high for us to simply allow the extremism of a small but well-funded right-wing minority to go unchallenged." So far, more than 24 people or groups have donated at least $1 million to the new super PACs that have formed around this election. So in looking at the 2012 election and where we are so far in terms of the role of money in elections, so far Obama has not quite outraised his 2008 numbers, although he's projected to. He's raised about $432 million for his reelection. This is what's interesting. About 37% of that comes from small individual contributions, things he's put out on the internet, donate $5 today, $20 today. 63% have come from large individual contributions. There are about 638 elites that are directing about $143 million for Obama's reelection campaign. And some of the top contributors are, besides some of the PACs I mentioned, the University of California, Microsoft, Google, and Harvard University. And again, the biggest PAC, super PAC behind him is Priorities USA Action. Now, Romney hasn't raised quite as much. He's raised about $279 million. Only 18% are from small individual contributions, while about 82% come from very large individual contributions. There have been 34 individuals that have bundled a total of about $5 million for Romney, and some of the top contributors, and again, this is what I think is interesting to note, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and some of the top super PACs are Restore Our Future, American Crossroads, or Crossroads GPS, and Americans for Prosperity. And all these figures come from the Center for Responsive Politics, or Open Secrets. It's a great resource if you want to check any of this information. So why am I throwing all these figures and names at you? Well, because I think it's an important discussion to look at where the money comes from in terms of our American elections. Who's behind it? And unfortunately, in 2012, as a result of the Citizens United decision, the short answer is we're not exactly sure anymore. What's happened is there has been almost a hidden or a shadow electoral process created. An election that happens to be outside of the voting process and without much transparency and among a very small group of elites who use money as political voice. The bigger question I have with all of this is, what does this mean in terms of expectations or implications? What do folks who are donating these amounts of money, what do these super PACs expect in return for these kinds of contributions? What comes in exchange for that? And ultimately, what are the implications for this for American democracy and American elections? For example, it costs a lot of money to win an election. Does that then influence the candidates who decide to run, the choices that we have? Does that influence representation when you have small groups that have this amount of impact or influence? How does that play out in terms of who has access to the process, who has access to have inputs in what happens, and how power is distributed? So the questions I want you to think about as we continue down this panel and later open it up for discussion is, do you think that the role of money in elections creates unequal representation in favor of the wealthy elite who fund campaigns and support candidates at unprecedented numbers? Does it narrow our choices of candidates because it costs so much to have a successful electoral run? And does this fundamentally undermine the process of representative democracy by restricting our choices and our level of influence? Essentially, is money the new vote, or do votes still really matter? So hopefully we'll open that up to discussion and explore that.
One of the things I've always been interested in as a social scientist is how inequality affects a society, particularly how when you have concentration of resources and opportunities in some segments of society, and when they're not very widely distributed, how that affects the, just people's ability to meet their basic needs. And certainly, there's no better illustration of that than in the political process. It's interesting when we look at, again, the levels of concentration of wealth in our society, where we have evolved to at this point, and the level of suffering. And again, how we're talking about a society that has become very polarized along economic and social matters. And certainly, again, the political process is an excellent window in which to look at that. A few weeks ago, I read a book by the Wall Street Journal columnist Robert Frank. And the book is called Redistribution. It's about the new wealthy and how their lives and their behavior and how it's affecting the rest of us. And one of the interesting points he raises in the beginning of the book, he says that the wealthy, because not only do they have more money, but they invest their money in different places, sometimes even in other countries. And they live differently, and there are multiple houses. They consume much differently. They consume goods we've never heard about. They vacation different. They send their children to different schools. I mean, he says they live in a virtual country of their own. And again, when we think, I'm encouraging us to, perhaps this is how we should think of the political financing process as well. We're talking about people who have significant resources that they can create their own political realities, and they have the ability to fund those realities into implementation. And so certainly, as we think about the political process and political power, I think it's important to see the role that money plays in that. A little bit of background here. Certainly, we live in a society of deepening inequalities. I mean, there are historical patterns that illustrate how we've become a much more unequal society. Not to go into great detail, but just some basic data here. In the United States, roughly today, the top 1% of the population makes about 20% of the income. The top 5% of the population makes about 35 to 40% of the income. And the top 10% of the population, top 10%, makes nearly 50% of the income. Now, if you look at the other part of those figures, we'll see that the 99% of us, the 95% of us, or the 90% of us, we're not, by contrast, we're not making very much. And again, what we see, this is a major problem in American society because it manifests itself in so many ways. The patterns of inequality that we see in our society have been long in motion. They haven't, but this is something that just didn't occur within the last few years. It's a pattern we've observed since probably the late 1960s, early 1970s. If you look at any indication of inequalities, we'll see, for example, some of you may have know of something called the Gini Index. The Gini Index, G-I-N-I, is an index of inequality. And in the Gini Index, 1.0 is perfect equality. So if it was 1.0, that means everyone is relatively equal. But if it's 0, excuse me, let me reverse that. If it's 1.0, it means that income is terribly concentrated. That means there are very few people, in many cases, one person who owns all the wealth. If it's 0.0, it means that we're perfect equally. In other words, the lower the number is, the more equality we have in society. Just to give you some rough figures of that, I believe in, here it is. In 1967, the Gini Index for the United States was 0.39. By 1970, it was 0.394. By 1980, up to 0.40. And just to give you some, today it's about 0.47. So we've seen a significant increase in the Gini Index of inequality. And again, this is consistent with everything we know, all the data we've seen on inequality, the growth of inequality over the last few years. And again, I want to talk a little bit more about its relationship to the political process. Again, just to give some basic figures here, looking at fundraising for presidential elections from 1976 to 2008. In 1976, $171 million was raised in presidential contributions. $171 million. Seems like, I think in some states it would take that much to win a Senate seat. By 1980, it actually went down to $162 million. I'll just go through these figures very quickly. By 1984, $202 million. 1988, $324 million. 1996, $425 million. 2000, $530 million. 2004, $880 million. 2008, $1,750 million. And I believe that we're projected at what?
Well over $2 billion.
Okay.
Well over $2 billion is what they're projecting for 2012.
And there, what we see are tremendous increases in every 4 years. I mean, just astronomical sums of money being used for the presidential race. Now, one of the things that I find most revealing about looking at this is who contributes to this process. And Chelsea began addressing this a few minutes ago, and I think it's very revealing. I'm going to look at it in a kind of micro fashion. This is from, again, Americans for the site Americans for Campaign Reform. Less than 1% of Americans contribute 80% of the funds. Let me reread that. Less than 1% of Americans contribute 80% of the funds. Less than 0.5% of the U.S. population contributed $200 or more. Less than 1/2 of 1%. Less than 1/10 of 1% contributed $2,300 or more. That's 1/10 of 1% contributed $2,000 or more, $2,300 or more. Approximately 4% of Americans made contributions at all in 2008. And as expected, men contributed 68% of all money compared to 32% for women. Here, it becomes even more revealing, I think. The geographic concentration of major donors. The 5 top metropolitan area of contributions were New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, and Boston. Those 5 cities, not the 5 states that they're located in, contributed $726 million, or more than the 36 states below it combined. Again, those 5 cities contributed more than the 39 states at the bottom of the list combined. And we can go further. Residents of Manhattan's Upper East Side, that is 5 zip codes, contributed $72 million in 2008, more than each of the 39 states and 50 times the national average. Again, that's one area, the area bordered by Central Park on the west, the East River on the east, 59th Street on the south, and 96th on the north. That area alone was responsible for nearly 60% of all contributions. And again, as Chelsea also addressed, the types of industries that were the major contributors. What does this say about us and our society when we have such concentrations of wealth and concentrations participating or contributing in the political process? Certainly it suggests that democracy is at risk. If money is the major source in determining political voice, who are the people, who are the interests that have the loudest voice? And why are they able to have that voice? And lastly, in this era of hyper-spending, hyper-consumption by few people, whose voices are being silenced? Again, I just wanted to throw out those questions, and perhaps we can come back to some of those later during the question and answer session.
Thank you, Don.
Hi there, I'm Daniel Cortese. I'm also affiliated with the Political and Justice Studies and the new Anthropology and Sociology program. I begin almost every class with a concept of the sociological imagination, which for C. Wright Mills was to understand personal troubles as more broadly structurally caused and public issues. And so I often ask them the question that's very personal, and I say to them, I ask them, give me reasons why I would have married the same person 3 times. And they laugh and they chuckle, and like the faces that I'm seeing right now, look a little surprised. And oftentimes I end up getting a response that comes back, I was nuts. They construct stories back of histories of why I was horrible in my PhD, and I was stressed, and all these backstories. And not one thinks of the structural reasons until I explain to them one sentence, and that is because they voted on my marriage. And then it all floods back, and they start recognizing that marriage, as we see in the United States and globally, is structured in a way that is shaped in heterosexual privilege and an understanding of a culture and cultural definition that marriage is really one man, one woman. To understand that concept today makes sense for us in a university where students can start to then see that there were issues, but this wasn't always the case. I'm taking some data from gay marriage laws, and the concept that I'm trying to engage us in today in the discussion is that over the course of my lifetime, and certainly of your voting lifetime, you've watched a strategy of gay marriage become a wedge issue to actually becoming, in this election, a source of firing up the base for the Democratic Party. And how did that transformation happen? And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that changing terrain of the political environment. There's 3 ways in which gay marriage gets enacted, the definition of gay marriage. And one is through a legislative referendum. That is, your legislators go together, they convene, they write a law, and it gets passed, signed by a governor, and the deal is done. But then there are citizen-initiated referendums, those that are initiated by citizens themselves, put to the public, and put to a vote. And then there's a popular referendum, and those are the ones where a legislature will often go and vote for gay marriage, and then there is the vote to repeal it. So in 2000, only 2 states had a citizen-initiated referendum. That was California and Nebraska, and both passed. In 2003, though, the political terrain changed when Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that there was no legitimate state interest for denying lesbian and gay couples the right to marriage, and so marriage was legal. And the Democratic legislature that had the option of repealing that passed on the opportunity, and they did not vote to repeal. So by 2004, instead of just 2 states, just the previous election before that, 13 laws go on the books. 6 were, in particular, a referendum. Some of them were in the western states, but 2 in particular were of importance, Ohio and Michigan. Why might these states be important? Swing states, exactly. This was a Karl Rove strategy, was to go and fire up the base by having gay marriage on the ballot. It would attract people that were probably more in favor of a Bush presidency. And so in these really tightly contested states, there was a push of people into the polls. And as we have seen in history, John Kerry did lose Ohio by a slim margin, and part of that was attributed to this strategy by Karl Rove. In 2006, it continued this strategy. There was a tremendous wave against a Bush presidency by the population. They were growing weary of the Iraq War and of some bunglings that had happened in the presidency, and so there was a risk of the Congress moving from Republican control to Democratic control. So Karl Rove's strategy was to, again, pull people that shared in a similar mindset to the polls. In 2006, there was 2 in particular, Arizona and Colorado. Again, Colorado is starting to become what we had just defined as a swing state, one that can go Republican or Democrat. Well, Arizona fails. They are unable to pass the law in popular demand. So the strategy doesn't quite make it. But then in 2008, in a very ebullient California, by an election that brought in Barack Obama as president, simultaneously gays and lesbians were crying while they saw Proposition 8 pass. And it won by a slim majority. So when we move away from this concept, we start seeing that gay marriage was a wedge issue. And then we start seeing that it's no longer really looking as a single issue per se, although it is still a single issue, so I don't want to completely discount it, but we see something interesting transform in the 2012 election. We have an incumbent president who is battled with high unemployment, economic indicators that were not pointing to re-election, at least not in our collective memory of a president being reelected in these economic conditions. And we see a lot of disenchantment from his liberal support base, who are feeling that he didn't go quite far enough to go and promote the agenda that they elected him for. He then decides, actually probably goaded by his vice president, to go and embrace gay marriage and say that his position was no longer evolving, but had, in fact, evolved. So the Democratic Party then goes and writes that into their platform, and that they support marriage equality, as they called it, so full marriage equality. What this is interesting is that it didn't have the opposite effect on the Romney campaign, which, again, a weak candidate in a field of other weak candidates, where his level of support really has never been quite high. But there's not an embrace against gay marriage in the Romney campaign. It's still focused on economic issues. So why is this a strategy that one would be using today in a political party? And the question starts to be answered when we look at the support and the change of support over the past 4 years alone. The Pew Research data, where they asked people for support of same-sex marriage, the favorability rate in 1996, when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed, was 27%. By 2011, it went up to 46%, with only 45% opposing. So for the first time in Pew's history, was there more support for same-sex marriage and marriage equality. Numbers are up across the board. So even for Republicans, from 1996, their support of same-sex marriage was 15%, and it's now 27%. This is a remarkable jump. The majority, according to the CNN ORC International, show support for same-sex marriage at 54%. And now, in 2012, it spiked, since we've had the support from the incumbent president. So for me, this is saying that as the electorate starts to become more and more pro-marriage equality, it becomes less of a political liability. And so major parties can begin to embrace this. One of the interesting things that I find in the Pew study is that of all the generations, and they're looking at what they call the silent generation, which would be those who were around in World War II, the boomer generation, Generation X, I guess that's my generation, and the millennial, that's your generation for a lot of you out there. The most rise in percentage points were the boomers, where they had risen from a low of 26% in 1996 to 40% support. And the least change was actually in Generation X, where it was 40% in 1996 and only grew to 48% in 2011. The millennials are what really brings this number up in a majority support. They begin when we start looking at those numbers in 2001 at 51% and rise up to 61% in 2011. So it's the millennials that are pulling the electorate in that favor. So with that, I just end my discussion here and give us some points to think about, which is, what does this say about the political terrain today for you? Thank you.